Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I am Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Professor Steve Keen, author of Debunking Economics. Steve Keen, welcome back.
Great to be here, mate. Love your backdrop.
You're on the whirlwind tour, of course, debunking economics all over the world. What about George Osborne? Let's spend some time debunking George Osborne. He's not an economist, but he still managed to run the UK economy into the ground. The Office of National Statistics says middle-income household income in the UK is down £5,000 since 2008. Your thoughts?
Politicians believe what they think of the experts because all they want to have is little numbers they can quote and say in front of the TV, it's all going to be wonderful in the future. And they end up being suckers for an economic discipline that has no idea of how the economy operates, didn't see this crisis coming, and their advice has actually made it worse. And the trouble is Osborne is following that advice. So it's driven the economy down, and the only way you can see up is by causing another housing bubble, which is where, you know, what I call, they call it help to buy, I call it help to sell, has turned up. So you've got another property bubble, another asset speculation revival going on here. That's about as far as they've got, and it's running out of steam, as we can all see right now, and the real economy is continuing to tank. So we need to get rid of what I call the politico-financial complex. It's not the military-industrial complex that screwed up capitalism, which was Eisenhower's thoughts 40 years ago. It's the financial-politico complex, and that's where most of our problems come from. So they're making a bad situation worse. Right.
So the action on the ground, people are suffering from fuel poverty. They're freezing to death. They are malnourished in this country. Rates of malnourishment are now at, you know, decade-high levels. But those numbers never seem to factor into the chancellor's equations in terms of how the economy is doing. It's almost as if they're scapegoating the poor. As a matter of fact, Boris Johnson, the mayor here in London, has recently said that the reason the poor are poor is because they're stupid. And it sounds like eugenics almost. Is Osborne and these guys, are they back to the eugenics policies?
It feels that way. I mean, the classic thing is when you look at the research behind eugenics, which goes back to a guy called Sir Cyril Burt 50, 60, 70 years ago, that was as flaky as economic research. He actually did that whole thing, you know. So you mentioned the upper class would have an average IQ of 120, 100 for the middle class and 80 for the working class. And he did, suppose, like a twin study to support it. We then found out he made up about 70 of his 100 twins. It was all fraud, like almost everything else. And the reality is social structures lock talented people at the bottom of the system and make an incredible struggle to get up. And you get the upper class toffs who aren't necessarily all that bright, get their, you know, trip from PPE to running Westminster. It isn't brains.
Yeah, it's interesting around
class.
Culturally speaking, the poor have had different ways to break through the ceiling, the artificial ceiling. In America, you know, you have sports as a way, you know, basketball, for example, has been a way for Black Americans to break through the oppression of racism and financial degradation. In Canada, you know, I've spent a lot of time in Canada.
It's comedy.
Hockey. Well, ice hockey and comedy to some degree.
Yeah.
Here in the UK, you've got rock and roll. The music
so what can a boy do, poor boy do but to play in a rock roll band?
That's right.
You know.
So that's always. But now you're from Australia. I'm just curious, is anything, aside from brewing Foster's beer, is there anything over there
Unfortunately, we're as much of a bubble economy as this part of the planet is, so the main way to buy housing and real estate, watch it go up and have debt driving it behind there and think you're a genius.
So this financialization of the global economy is something that guys like Paul Krugman of the New York Times think is great because there's no such thing as debt. Debt doesn't matter. Interest rates can be at 0%, and there's no consequences ever. Your thoughts?
That's the deadly thing. I mean, that particular paper where he went across for the secular stagnation argument from Larry Summers, he actually said, so long as you don't build up bad consequences for the future. Now, the reality is when you take a look at what drives asset prices higher, it's rising levels of debt. And you've got to pay the debt back. You pay it back to banks, not towards other individuals. And that ultimately means this bubble has to fall over.
Let me ask you another possible fallout from low interest rates. We have an amazing degree of larceny, embezzlement, malfeasance here in the UK. This past few weeks has been the star turn of Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS. They've recently been caught targeting individuals and companies for death. You talk about eugenics. I mean, here they've got almost the whole program in place. But isn't that a negative consequence of cheap money is that it rewards criminality?
Well, because the cheap money, I mean, I've been arguing you had to drive rates down because I saw the debt bubble coming and said the economy can't cope with that level of debt servicing. You've got to reduce it for that reason. But the double consequence of that is these, you know, the people who are in the finance sector over here and the politicians with them, they expect to get, you know, 6 to 8% returns per annum, you know, above the rate of inflation. And if the economy is growing at less than 1%, they've got to do that in a parasitic way. And one way they can do it is by the sort of stuff you're talking about, the Royal Bank of Scotland, you know, targeting businesses, sending them under, getting their assets, selling those for a profit coming out ahead. It's parasitic behaviour of the financial sector on the real economy. And it was bad enough when the bubble was driving up. Now that the bubble's run out of the steam because of the sheer level of debt that's been accumulated, it truly can be parasitic behaviour.
It sounds like communism, the old days where we had to generate a certain number of tractors, comrade. Or the poor must be fed, the wheat harvest must be higher, said Mao. And as a result, they introduced pogroms that were slaughtered people to meet their targets. Or statistically, on a milder basis here in the UK, to meet certain educational standards, they have targets for testing and things like this, which ends up de-educating or making the population, you know, dumb, and then Boris Johnson will come along and say, well, you're dumb and that's why you're poor, and then they'll take more money. But this targeting of economic numbers and then making their assumptions fit the targets has no bearing on the real economy, correct?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I'm a fan of the innovative side of capitalism. I'm also somebody who said that innovative side can lead to crises and catastrophes occasionally. You've got to balance it with the state sector to some degree. But the thing that I find infuriating is what I call the bureau-crazies. And these people, not the bureaucracy, bureau-crazy. And you get the points targets and the objectives they set and so on, and they end up stifling the innovative side of capitalism while not giving you the sort of balancing you'd want the state to do at the same time. And I see these bureau-crazies running universities these days and degrading innovative research because they can't handle people that don't fit inside their boxes. You see it with targeting of education, and it really does feel like you've actually got, you know, Chairman Mao in control or Joseph Stalin supposedly being champions of capitalism.
Now, let's talk about this idea you just mentioned, a mixed economy or a balanced economy or having the state involved economically at some times or some sectors and having private markets and private enterprise involved really in a more balanced way. It seems that this is a really difficult balance to strike because of the ideological forces on both sides.
Exactly.
At some point, the statists own the megaphone, they own the media, and they broadcast their message of state control. And sometimes it becomes, in the U.S. and at times is free markets rule above and beyond the anarcho-capitalists. You know, they have that group of ideological stalwarts. Is there an example that you can give of a balanced economy either in history or in the current global economy, or is it a balance that's just too of a utopian vision that we really can never expect to ever happen?
Yeah, I mean, it is something that I think you could say America in the 50s and 60s had that sort of balance, but a lot of that was paranoia about the Russians. And that paranoia about the Russians meant two things. First of all, the huge arms expenditure they did, which then gave, you know, tremendous boost to innovation in American capitalism as well. But you also had them, they couldn't let the workers' wages fall too low, because if workers' wages were too low, Russia would start to look attractive, you know, the ideology of Russia.
That's a very interesting point, Steve Keen. So you're saying that, because during the 30s, of course, in the United States, a lot of people emigrated to Russia. And there was communism was a factor in U.S. politics, and you had Joseph McCarthy and other people politically rise up, and there was a whole effort to deal with communism, you know, on American soil. But the wages at that time and the promise of socialism and communism was attractive to force people to other countries. Today in America, the wages here in the UK are virtually at a complete standstill. They haven't grown at all, really, for decades. And purchasing power is collapsing. They get no return on savings. But there's no country to go to, because every single country in the world is guided by some central bank. So they're all the countries in the world have now adopted this psycho, Paul Krugman-esque, print money till you die, debt is great, wages are terrible. And but wouldn't it make sense, and is it how do you get around the blunt force trauma of a pro-statist argument that, in fact, minimum wage and wages need to go up?
Oh, well, I mean, I've got to come out in Paul Krugman's defence here. He's saying he wants wages to rise in America as well. And I think capitalism of the 50s and 60s was post-Fordist capitalism, where Ford actually bumped up the wages he paid to his workers so that they could afford to buy the cars they were producing on the production line. And you had this belief that both profits and wages had to rise over time. And that's healthy capitalism. But we've gone across to this predatory capitalism where firms try to relocate their production to cheap wages and they try to sell back to high-wage countries. Does not work. It works for the individual firm, but it brings down the wage levels over there.
So let me ask you this. A very simple graphic here. We got a couple minutes left. Yeah. Here's the central bank, and the money is being printed, and it flows off the central bank like the water coming from the source of the Nile. And it can go in one of two places or both places. It can go toward banks to speculate. It can go toward workers in the form of wages. These days, due to financial engineering, there seems to have been an irrigation project where it only goes to speculators who get the cheap money, and it doesn't go to workers. So my question is this. The solution is either A, allow wages to rise in some commensurate ratio to the money supply that's going to bankers, or B, you must raise interest rates to get rid of those zombie banks. But we have instead the worst possible situation where the zombie banks get the cheap money and workers get nothing. Isn't that the worst of all possible worlds?
It's the worst of all possible worlds. I mean, there was, the way the Reserve has set up its money goes to the banks, it goes to the reserves. They don't give the money to the public, but there was a section, and I mean was, section 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act that allowed them to give money to the workers directly, which would be part of what I call a modern Jubilee structure, and that was abolished by the banks with the what's the new act called? Not the one that sort of brought back parts of Glass-Steagall. That's how it was portrayed. But a specific part of the legislation got rid of the capacity, the Federal Reserve, to actually give the money to the public, and the banks lobbied for that.
So was it one of these recent, like Dodd-Frank?
Yeah, Dodd-Frank. That was hidden in the subtext of that. They got rid of that particular section of the Federal Reserve. They abolished it.
Section what?
Section 13.3.
They
got rid of it.
Who gave who the right to what?
They gave the Federal Reserve the right, with a majority vote, to direct the money to the public rather than to the banks.
They had that right.
They had that right, and they abolished it under Dodd-Frank.
Even though now, obviously, and so in other words, they got rid of Glass-Steagall. They made casino speculating legal under Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Yeah. And here they abolished another function of the Fed.
That could have let them do something good. What are you talking about?
What a bunch of shysters.
I know.
This is quite revealing.
Yeah, we're still, the political financial complex dominates it. We've got to get rid of them.
Well, so what are you doing here in the UK anyway? We got about 20 seconds.
Talking to a whole bunch of rebel students, rebels in Oxford, rebels in Manchester, and meeting up with Terry Jones and talking about a documentary he's doing.
Monty Python?
He had a great dinner last night. He's producing a documentary.
Are you in the reunion concert?
Oh, I'd love to, but I'm afraid I can't stand spam.
Oh, fair enough. All right, Steve Keen, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for being on the Kaiser Report.
Delighted, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Steve Keen of DebtDeflation.com. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Kaiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.